of different stuff. So really quick, I just want to run through how to copy UVs from one object to another if that's not something you've seen. It's fairly straightforward. So I'm just going to duplicate this head, which, not that it's really relevant. If anyone cares, this is still the self-caricature low poly UVs that is on the Google Drive, but it's not really relevant specifically to the lectures. But you can see like the UVs are nicely laid out. So I'm just going to grab this second head and do let's go with a planar map. That's not going to make me sad at all. We'll just planar map the side of this head. So we have one set of like good UVs and one set of terrible UVs. To copy these, you just select the mesh with good UVs that you want to duplicate to the other one. Shift select the gross mesh with gross UVs, and go to Mesh, Transfer Attributes, and just open up the tool settings. And usually, so if you just want UVs, you can transfer a lot of different stuff. But for this top part, just check off everything except UV sets. And I've found that usually for transferring UVs, I'm going to either use local or components for sample space. Doing world or UV space tends to like make them copy weird, and I haven't found a difference between local and components. I'm just going to grab local. And then there's some other options for like mirroring UVs or flipping UVs, but I just want a straight copy from one to the other, so I'm going to ignore that. And I should just be able to hit apply. And now if I look in my UV editor, what did I just... you can see that the mesh that previously had gross UVs now has nice UVs, so they both have reasonable UVs. Just like a really quick, just undo that. All right, so again, I'll show you what happens if you do like world space instead of local. So I'll select my good object, my gross object, and then set this to world, do apply. You can see, yeah, it like does some real weird stuff where it's trying to copy it a different way, like basically by choosing world or local, local or component. It's looking at more or less like the object itself and not where that object is in space. So if this object theoretically were not moved and was just directly on top of the original head, I would be fine to copy that with world space. But otherwise, if it's moved, it's going to usually do really bad stuff to your UVs. But that's honestly basically how you can copy UVs if you ever need to. So again, just like turn off everything except UVs, UV sets, local or component, and then unless you need to flip UVs or mirror it, just turn those off. Otherwise, select whatever axis you want to mirror over. Any questions on that? All right, I feel like I was like pretty straightforward and to the point. All right. So other thing I wanted to go over, I mentioned that I figured out how to batch render from multiple different cameras without needing to do a bunch of super crazy setup. So I'll show you guys how to do that really quick. I'm just going to throw in two cameras in the scene. I'll just put one behind the character and one in front of the character because I'm not feeling at all creative with my camera placement. Go back to my perspective camera. So you can see we have two cameras facing the character. And then I'm just going to do something random to this character and just sort of, what am I doing? I'm just going to do some like light animation so you can actually see the progression of what is happening with this. So I'm literally just going to make it rotate sideways in space like a maniac because this seems like a great plan. So basically what I'm going to do is I'll render the first 10 frames, and I want the first 5, say, to render from camera 1, and the next 5 to render from camera 2. And the easiest way I found to do this is to set up render layers. You can do a lot of stuff with these. I'm not going to get crazy deep into them right now. But you can open the render setup editor. Either there's like a little button for it directly to the right of the hypershade bubble. So you can open it there, or you can go to Windows, Rendering Editors, Render Setup, and open it there. And it'll pull up this this little window box here. And basically what this shows is, so this up here is effectively the default render layer that Maya sets up for your scene. So if you've ever been in your render settings and you've seen this render layer, master layer, this is what that is. This is your master layer. It has everything in your scene, all your lights, all your cameras. And I've never tried to play with it or edit it, but I'm fairly certain that you can't. It's just a default thing Maya has set up. So we actually want to make 2 additional render layers. So to do that, just click on this little plus layer button. I'll just label this like cam1, do whatever makes sense for you. And you can see that like as soon as you start adding stuff in this little box here, this is just all the custom layers you can make. It starts putting some more info over here. So you actually, and this is like a really convoluted setup, honestly, but to actually put things or like add objects to your layer, you need to right click on this new layer you've done and do create collection. At which point you have actual information and some boxes of like things that you can add to your scene. So what you're going to want to do is go, so I'll say camera 1, and I'll just middle mouse button and drag that into this little box over here. And you can see basically that it'll just sort of be like, hey, this is in my layer. So now that we actually have multiple layers in your scene, you can see pretty much like if you have a layer in Photoshop or something like that, there's like that little eyeball icon. So whichever one is blue at the current time is the one you're looking at. So right now, that is my master layer with like everything in my scene. If I click on the camera 1 layer, it's going to show me everything in that scene, which in this case is the lighting. It seems like is more or less just sort of transferred from scene to scene. But you can see that like all my geometry is gone. It's just the camera and my little sky dome light. So what I want to do is add the other stuff into my scene, because if there's nothing there, there's nothing to render. So I'm just going to grab my little person and my plane and also drag those into the scene. And you can see that once I do that, they actually pop up and will actually render stuff. So anything that you want to actually render from this camera, you should throw into this scene. So if you have like any meshes, anything like that, they need to go in here or else the camera is not going to render them. Any questions on that so far? All right. So that's layer for camera 1. We do want another layer for the camera 2. So I'll set that up the same way and just make a new layer, create a collection within that layer, grab camera 2, and this time I know I want all my geometry in it, so I'm just going to grab all of that at the same time and dump that in there. So we have now 2 layers with basically the same stuff, just sort of swapping the different cameras in each layer. So that is effectively the end of the setup you need to do in the render setup editor. Before we wander over to the render settings, does anyone have any questions about any of that? All right. So I'm just going to close out of that, pull open my render settings, and you'll notice that like up at this render layer now, we have options for not only master layer, but these camera 1 and camera 2 layers that we've created. So what I'm going to do is just go through and I'll click on cam 1, and actually there is a thing that I forgot to do in the editor. So I just pulled up my render editor again, or render setup. I just use the little icon up here. But basically so there's the visibility, which is like what scene are you looking at. Right next to that, there is this little button for setting the layer to be renderable for batch rendering. So in this case, I'm not using my master layer for anything. Like I don't really want to render out of that. So I'm just going to uncheck that. So the only thing that will actually render when I do the batch render is the camera 1 and camera 2 layers. So if you're not planning on rendering from a specific camera and like you're just using master layer to sort of like keep all your stuff in your scene and like navigate around, then check that button off, or else it'll still render all of the stuff for that scene, which you probably don't want or need. All right, so back into render settings. So for camera 1, like I said, I want to say render the first maybe 5 frames out of there. So for your frame extension, just choose something that allows you to enter frame ranges. And now what you can do, since you have multiple layers, if you right-click on the text for like the start and end frame, do create relative override for visible layer. Once you click that, it'll highlight this orange and be like, hey, this has different settings from my typical master layer, like everything else. This is like a custom setting for this layer only. So that you can enter 1 for your start frame, and again, just right-click, do relative override, and I'll set this to 5 for my end frame. So you can do this with a lot of different settings. You could do it with, I mean, pretty much anything in here. For some of the stuff, sometimes it doesn't give you the option for relative override, it'll be absolute, but it does more or less the same thing. And you can also set different, I'm not going to super go into it, but like if you wanted to grab your object and set an override for a particular layer, for visibility, like you should be able to go into like your visibility and just make an absolute override for primary visibility and turn it off or something like that for just that layer. So it's not only render settings you can do this with, it's like attributes of the materials and the objects themselves. But either way, any questions on that? All right. So I have camera 1 set up. I'm going to go through and do the same thing for camera 2. You'll notice that as soon as I clicked into camera 2 layer, it got rid of my overrides and set these back to the sort of world defaults. So right click again, relative override, and do the same thing. I just sort of like doing it, even though the end frame is already set. I'm just paranoid. So that should be set up and ready to go for rendering. And I have not set my project folder, but we're just going to render this to the sad default project folder in Maya. So I'm just going to batch render this. What? Oh, whoops. It's actually really weird because this worked like every other time. So you can see as it's going along, it should, or wait, no, this is, whoops, my bad, that was sequence render. Oh, that's so dumb. Okay. My computer is yelling at me about access. I literally just noticed a thing where if you try to open the render settings for batch render with Arnold, it won't work. But if you just click batch render, it will then work, which is really dumb. Anyway, so I'm just going to go and dig around really quick in the computer for my default Maya folder. Document, Maya, project, default. So it should, if you've not set your project, dump everything in the images folder. But you'll notice that it's actually made like a nice little folder for camera 1 and camera 2. And if we look at these, I mean, they're super stretched, but you can see it's only rendered frame 1 to 5 from camera 1. And then if we go to camera 2, for some reason it's duplicated some of the frames, but it's gone through and sort of rendered the other ones. I should have set this to be not an EXR. Is this? What the heck? Like 5 seconds. I think it's doing that thing where anytime I demo this on my own computer, it works perfectly, and now it's just like, what if no? Okay. Yeah, so it's just not a lot of motion actually happening in the head. But yeah, so I mean, you can see it's gone through and just sort of like rendered the correct frames. Again, I'm not entirely sure why it's rendered these 5. It's like duplicated this stuff from camera 2, but it has gone through and successfully rendered both of those cameras from the specified frame ranges. Does that make sense? Cool. I actually also just realized that I'm a dingus and this all rendered from my perspective camera. So don't forget as you're going through and actually doing things in your render settings to make an override for each layer and like set perspective to be camera 2. And if you don't do that, again, it's just going to render from your perspective camera. So that is an important thing to do. But yeah, more or less rendering from different cameras. Any questions on that? All right. This is definitely handy. I actually didn't know, I never even thought to check for that until people asked me about it, and I was like, oh, that actually would save a lot of time. Also good if you're like farming out your renders, which you guys are welcome to do, by the way, to some like third-party renderer, because that way you don't need to like set up a bunch of crazy stuff. You can just tell it to go, and it should be fine. All right. So apart from that, I have a few different things that I was planning on going over today. And I would shoot to do whatever is going to be most useful to you guys first. So I have some stuff on like dynamic curves, which is basically just like a fairly easy way to animate a curve and have it drive joints, which would be great for stuff like tails, or you know, like twiddles and hair or something like that. I could do some basic stuff on end cloth if you needed to have, you know, some cloth ripping, or you wanted to like drape cloth or something like that. Or I could do a little bit on particles, and that would basically be stuff like emitters, different ways to make rain, that kind of stuff. Anybody have a preference on the first thing we go over? Otherwise, I'm just sort of going to go in order of whatever I did last class. All right, dynamic curves it is. So I'm just going to actually just delete that and hide all that. All right, so let's assume that, I know some of you guys are doing stuff like tails, so I'll show you guys how to bind this to a rig later. But basically the first thing we want to do is, if you are doing something like a rig, I'm just going to set up like a really sad little joint chain really quick, and I'm just going to use X. I'm just going to use X to snap the joints to the grid. I'm not being like particularly careful about how I set this up. I'm just going to sort of call this good. And then I will also make a sad little cylinder so that I have something to actually bind this to later. So I'll just give that some subdivisions and then just sort of scale that up so it kind of fits over my sad little joint chain I just made. So if you're going to drive a rig with this, you should set up the curve on your joint chain. If you're not, do whatever shape you want. It doesn't really matter. So what you're going to do is just go to your Create menu, Curves, and usually CV and EP both work. If you're hooking it up to a joint, I find that EP curves work a little bit better because of the way they're calculated. But again, both technically do work. So I'm just going to set up a little EP curve, and if you just sort of press and hold, if you just press and hold V, it'll vert snap those little points on the curve directly to your skeleton so that everything is lined up perfectly. So you can see that we have a curve nested right in the center of that skeleton there. And this is pretty much all you need to start. So I'm just going to actually make this curve dynamic or have it animate automatically, you just select it, and it's actually a function of nHair in Maya. So you need to go into your FX menu, go into nHair, and pretty much just, you should be able to just check make selected curves dynamic. There are a few settings in here which you can play with if you want to, but the default settings do actually usually work fairly well for this. So you'll notice as soon as you do that, so again, that's nHair, make selected curves dynamic. And you'll notice as soon as you do that, it throws a bunch of stuff in your Maya scene. So it makes a hair system, and that's basically just information about the hair itself. If you have like multiple pieces of hair, it's kind of a place to collect all of that info. If you've ever worked with NCloth, you'll notice this nucleus. It's the same thing that NCloth does. It basically defines gravity in your world, if there's any wind, stuff like that, sort of forces in the world. And it's also gone through and made this like hair system follicles and hair output curves. So the original curve is going to be under that follicle system, and the newly animated curve is going to be under the output curves, right? So it's gonna, output curves is like the new curve, so that's kind of like makes sense where that would be. And nothing is gonna really happen until I go ahead and play this animation, and even then, oh god, sorry. We turn off this head really quick. And this is another important thing. If you're doing any kind of simulation, not just dynamic curves, you want to always make sure that your playback speed is set to play every frame. I'm going to set mine to max real time. It's going absurdly fast. But for sims, it does need to actually calculate each and every frame. Otherwise, your sim is probably not going to calculate correctly, and what you see in the viewer may be wildly inaccurate. So again, any kind of sims, make sure that you're doing a playback for every frame. So if I play this, again, you'll notice like nothing really happens. That's mostly just because this is a very uninteresting shape to make dynamic. So there is actually a neat thing you can do, which works for dynamic curves and sort of a few different other things, but mostly dynamic curves. And that is, if you go into the Fields and Solvers menu still under the FX tab, you can turn on interactive playback. So that is, again, Fields and Solvers, interactive playback. And if I grab that original curve, I'm now able to actually move it. And you can see a real-time preview of that other little curve that's sort of flopping around on it. So this is like good for testing settings of stuff. Let's do 1,000 frames because I feel crazy. So I'll be using interactive playback probably a lot for this demo because it's good to test things. So you'll notice that and unfortunately though, you do need to click on interactive playback like every time you want to actually start a playback. But you'll notice that the curve is this new curve, the little blue one, is attached at the top and bottom of this piece, which isn't good for some things, not necessarily what you want for everything, thinking like a tail. So for a tail, it's attached on the body, and then the rest kind of flops around. So if you click on the, right above the original curve, there's this little follicle 1 that was created. If you go into your attribute editor, you'll notice that there is a setting called point lock. And right now that is set to both ends. If I set that to base, it's going to only attach the curve at the first part of the original curve, which is always a weird thing to describe. If it doesn't behave the way you want, try a different setting. So I'm just going to interact playback again. So grab my original curve, and if I flop this around, you can see that the bottom is now sort of free form and like just doing its own thing, and it's not attached. If I set point lock to the tip, it's going to snap it so it's attached to the other end. So it's not really important which way you create your curve. It can potentially be set up to behave fine from either end. You can do, again, both ends is what it was set to originally. That was really fast. And then you can also do no attach. So you just have like a free form curve that will just fall off into nothingness. I honestly have never found a use for that, but I'm sure that there is a use. So that is, the basics of like how to set up a dynamic curve. There's also settings if you go into, where is it? What the heck? Shape settings. So there's a bunch of different settings you can choose. You can edit like the stiffness of your follicles. If you want to just sort of edit all of the settings for the curve at once, you can do that under the hair system shape. So you'll notice there's a bunch of stuff for collisions. If you want the curve or curves to self-collide, option for that here. You can also add a bunch of different stuff like bounce or friction, or so like I'll stretch and compression resistance super low because that usually makes things behave really weird. But if you wanted to sort of edit how that curve is moving, make it a little bit stiffer or something like that, that's usually where you would do it. So let's see. What have I done? Yes, I've set it to not be attached, which is the opposite of what I want. So again, just go into follicle 1 shape, and I will set that to be attached at the top. And interactive playback. All right. So you can see now that this is behaving like really differently. Like it's now, if you move this really fast, it's getting like crazy stretchy and long. And that's again, because I modified the stretchiness of my curve. So depending on what you want, if you're doing something like a tail, you probably don't want that much stretchiness, but you can sort of fiddle with the settings to behave in the way that you need. And also don't be afraid to, if something is like perfect for most of your sim and behaving a little weird in one area, you can keyframe those settings so that it's, in that one problem area a little bit less stretchy or like is a little bit more resistant to compression, that kind of thing, to achieve exactly the effect that you want. Any questions on that so far? All right, cool. So again, like I said, that's the basics of how to make a curve dynamic. Pretty much any shape curve will work. I'll show you really quick how to hook it up to the skeleton that we created. So I'm going to unhide these joints. And I'm just going to go through and put my curve back in the original position, which is for some reason no longer in my joints, which is weird. All right. I'm just going to fudge this and drag it kind of back into my joints. I don't really know how it got so off-center, but whatever. All right, so I'll throw this here. And so this is, again, how to basically attach a joint chain to the curve. Ideally, you would have the control points in your curve set up on each of these little joint chains, or like one for each joint. It will work if you don't do that. But I'm just going to go through my rigging menu, skeleton, and I want to do create IK spline handle. So this is not like the normal IK handle that you used for rigging. This is a different thing that's driven by a curve. So I'll open the settings for that. And basically, there's a bunch of settings. Check all of them off. And then turn on snap curve to root. That's pretty much going to attach the curve to the skeleton, and then everything else I more or less just leave the same. So that's, again, IK spline handle tool, turn everything off except the snap curve to root. And what you're going to do is click on, setting it up is pretty much the same way as you do an IK. Click on the top joint, click on the bottom joint, and then this one has the added, you do need to click on the curve itself, and that is the dynamic curve. So I'm just going to actually click on that in my outliner. And you'll notice that as soon as I do that, it goes through and it creates this little IK handle, which would be really nice if they called like IK spline or something different, but they didn't. So if I once again go into my effects menu and fields and solvers, interactive playback, I'm just going to grab this curve and drag it around, and you can see that it's moving the joints, just not quite in the way that I want. Looks a little ridiculous, and the joints aren't really synced up. You can see they're like sort of following, but not quite. That's basically just a function of how I have my outliner set up right now. Just Control-Z that. So in this case, I actually want so I'm picturing, again, something like a tail setup, where this should be anchored to like a body of some sort. So I'm just I will make a sad sphere, and I'm just gonna pretend that this is like the body or skeleton or whatever of my character I want this tail to follow. So grab the joint and just parent that under the sphere. So now if I grab this and move this around, it'll control the rest of it. What I also want to do is take the whole hair follicle system and parent that under the first joint. So you notice like that joint kind of stayed in position when I originally moved the curve. So basically it's kind of like a deformer, where you want the deformer to move with the object if you don't want your object to sort of stretch really crazy. So again, grab the whole hair system follicles and parent that under joint 1. So that's like the top joint in my little chain. So now, theoretically, if I move this sphere, it's going to take my joints and also that little original curve I made. So now if you do interactive playback, and I move this sphere around, you'll see that we have, the joints are actually, some crazy settings on that. They are actually following the curve in a much more logical way. So again, that pretty much, it'll also work with like rotation, so you can rotate your object really crazy and the curve will sort of interact with that. So this is like basically how you'd set up something like a tail. If you, oops. And remember when I was like, you should always freeze your transformations before you do things? I didn't do that there. Delightful. But yeah, so there was one object, or one option when we were doing the make selected curves dynamic. That was like collide with mesh. If I wanted that to actually interact with this sphere itself, I should have checked that on. You should be able, I think, to go back and do that in post. So like if you've already created it, I always forget where it is, but there is, I believe, somewhere where you can actually check that on, where it will collide with other objects. And actually, I think to do that, you would also need to actually take the mesh and do nCloth create passive collider. This is sort of like the weird, it makes it basically interactable with that curve. So theoretically, if I do that and then do interactive playback, and I'll rotate this around again, you can see that now my curve is sort of like curling around that object a little bit, and it's like actually interacting with that object. If I had more points in my curve and more joints in my chain, this could be a much sort of bendier object. But this is, again, the sort of basics on how to do that. Any questions so far? All right. So really quick, I'll just show you, and this is going to be really weird looking because my joint chain is just not even close to the original cylinder that I created for this. But you can just bind this the same way that you normally would. So grab your joint chain, grab your skeleton, and then go to rigging, skin, bind skin. And now if I go to interactive creation or interactive playback, you can see that it's basically taking the little joint with it, and we now have like a lovely bendy tail sort of shape. So again, this is really handy for stuff like telephone wires, You can use this for tails, like I mentioned. A lot of people use this for hair and sort of creating like a little bit of movement in like a stylized hair. But yeah, pretty much dynamic curbs and attaching them to a skeleton. So you can do a bunch of other different sort of things with them. It just depends on the functionality that you need. Any questions on that before we move on to some particle stuff? All right, cool. In that case, I'm just going to delete all of this and the cylinder, and now we have fantastic. All right, so particle stuff, also in the FX menu, so I'm just going to hang out there. There is a little tab for N particles. If you click on that, there's basically two different types of emitters that you can make. An emitter is basically the thing that generates particles. So you can make just a basic emitter if you just go down and N particles to create emitter. You'll notice that it, again, puts a few different things into your outliner. So one of them is the emitter itself. So I'm just going to drag this up on top of the head. And the other one is the particles. So the emitter, if I just go ahead and play that play blast, is basically the only settings you're going to find there are things that affect the creation of the particles. So what shape am I generating this from? What direction are they coming from? Do they have any speed as they first start moving? That kind of thing. The particles are going to be settings on, you know, the way these things look, the way they behave after they've been spawned. Does that make sense? I'm still going to take that silence for a yes. Please feel free to stop me if you have questions. Okay. All right. So, like I said, emitter and particles. If we go into our emitter, there's a few different settings that we can choose. And these are really annoying about refreshing. So right now, the emitter type is set to Omni. You can set that to a few different things. So directional, I have not once found a use for this, but it can be done. There's also surface, which I think you need to do a few more things to get that to work. I also usually don't use those very frequently. There's also volume, and this is the other one that I sort of use. This is like, if I'm going to generate something like rain, I would go through and I would just make the scale of this basically really big, so it'd be dropping particles from a larger area. So you'll notice, like, if I set this to like 10 and 10, it starts making something that kind of looks like a sad sort of snow effect. And basically, if I was like doing something like this for snow, tweak the settings a bit, same thing for rain, just make it go a lot faster. But I will come back to that shortly. So I'll set this back to Omni for now. So that's one type of emitter. The other thing you can do, if you are so inclined, is to actually select a mesh. And if you go to N particles, you can do emit from object. And that will do something like this, where it's literally emitting particles from a specific object. So I did this once for like a skull. It was like a really weird sort of experimental thing I was trying to do. But you can go and do a bunch of stuff with this. So again, this one is actually going to make, it makes the emitter under the object itself, parented under it. You have the particles, and this one actually generates a nucleus as well. So like this is, again, the settings where you can have gravity and stuff like that. Basically what you could do, if you were so inclined, is to sort of play with these settings until the particles behave how you want. You'll notice it just sort of, if you see it like in the corners, it's just sort of continuously, very slowly spawning particles. If I ever wanted to get those to like fall or something like that, so they were just like stuck permanently on the character, I would want to go in, again, fields and solvers, and I usually just throw in a quick gravity field. And theoretically, let me restart my sim real quick. You'll notice that now they're actually sort of cascading off the person, and I've turned myself into Particle Santa. So there's sort of different ways that you can interact with particles that way. I'm not going to go over a lot of the emit from object stuff. It's sort of fairly self-explanatory, like once I go over the rest of particles, and this is going to take way longer to actually sim than the rest of stuff. But you can do it if you need to. Again, it's good if you need particles emitting from a weird shape, like say you want to make the effect that like a piece of wood or something is on fire. You can sort of have the particles emitting directly from that shape of wood or other irregular shapes. So I'll just go ahead and make another basic little emitter. And I want to show you a few different settings. What have I done? All right, there we go. If your particles are ever behaving weird, just restart your sim from frame 1. Particles, again, if I like jump to frame 40, it's gonna yell at you and be like, I can't just approximate the simulation over 400 frames. So I'll show you some settings for the particles really quick. The first one, if you select the particles themselves, I'm going to make these a little bit easier to actually see. So if you go onto the particle shape, and all the way down, there's a tab called shading. And this is, so I also want to, really quick, just make a point of, by default, particles are not going to render. They've literally never rendered before. Usually they don't render as well in Arnold or Redshift, but you can sort of assign your own textures to them and like make them different shapes if you want to. So again, I'm just going to go to my particles. You can set the particle render type to something other than points. So there's a bunch of different things. Numeric is actually showing you basically coordinates of all of these particles, or like tagged numbers for each of the particles. Good occasionally, but not really for rendering. You can set it to use like sprites, streaks. There's like weird settings for clouds, which have kind of blurry edges. I'm actually curious really quick to see if that renders. So you'll notice like a lot of the times the particles will render, but like not the opacity. I'm still working on taking the opacity into Arnold, but you can also render. I find particles render really, really nicely with Maya software, cough. And you will know my mania about not rendering with Maya software, but it does good things for particles. Like pretty much whatever you see in the viewport is more or less what renders if you render in Maya software. So a lot of times what I'll do, if I'm feeling so inclined, they also render way faster in Maya software. So I'll go through and I'll just sort of set up my scene so that nothing else renders except the particles, and then I'll just composite those onto my actual nice renders, and it's a just potential way of speeding up your render times. What I'm going to do is just set these to spheres so they're a little bit more visible on screen. So this is something which most definitely will render in pretty much any renderer because it's now like an actual little geometry item. So if we just, again, do a quick render, you'll notice these are being shaded pretty much like any other object. They're weirdly shiny. But if I wanted to, and I had someone ask in my last class, can you make these emissive? And the answer to that is yes, indeed you can. If you select your particle system, you can go through and just assign a new generic AI standard surface material, change that to, you can change the color to be whatever you want, so I'll make these like blue. And again, it behaves pretty much like any other piece of geometry would. And it actually creates a strangely interesting effect when you make it emissive. And it just gets like really sort of crazy. You can also, if you want, turn these, I think, into a mesh light at this point, if you ever for some reason wanted like glowing particles. But again, if you set these to be something like spheres or other pieces of geometry, they will behave pretty much like any other piece of geometry in your scene. So that is other thing I wanted to go over with particles. So there's a few different settings you can mess with in the emitter itself. You can play with the minimum distance and maximum distance. So if I set that higher, you can see that it's sort of like spawning them from random points in more like a sphere, kind of like volume around my original emitter. You can set the minimum distance to be higher, and then you get it sort of spawning from like a donut shape almost. You can play with the speed. So if I set that higher, you can see that they're shooting out of the emitter significantly faster than they originally were. You can also, and I actually usually advise messing with random, but let me set this to something really crazy, like 1,000, and I might regret that. All right, I absolutely do regret that. But you can see, so by doing speed random, you can basically randomize the speed of these emitters. So you can see you have some particles that are shooting out like really, really fast and others that are going like a little bit slower. I usually don't necessarily advise doing speeds this high. It does kind of work for stuff like rain. So I'll just set that back to something more rational. But these are, again, all settings that affect the particles only as like they're created immediately. Afterwards, it's the rest of the fields and other settings you have that control them. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to... interesting, setting speed to 0 pretty much just spawns them and then starts dropping them immediately. I'll set this back to 1. So if we go into your particles, again, there's a few other settings to play with, and where am I going? All right, so you can play with a few different things. Again, count. You can also, in the emitter, change how many particles are being spawned if you need, more or less of them. I'm just going to leave this as is for now. You can play with lifespan, so if by default it's set to live forever, you might imagine that eventually you'll get so many particles in your scene that the computation becomes really, really slow. You can set the lifespan to be constant or like random range. And here's the thing, I'm actually not entirely sure what unit of time the life of these objects is measured in. If it's certainly not frames, I don't know if it's like seconds or what. But you can see that they're eventually sort of slowly dying. If I set the random to be 1, some are going to die sooner, some are going to die a little bit later. So that's a really nice way to sort of get a little bit of a random effect into your sim. You can also mess with particle size, so once I've set this to be something like, if it's set to point, it's not going to change the size, but with something like a sphere or a cloud, you can mess with the size. Maybe if you're trying to make some kind of weird stylized like water or soda fountain or something like that. You can also mess with the radius. Basically, it's like an additional modifier on size, basically. And you'll notice that like when I check that, nothing actually happens. But if I look at the radius scale input, right now it's set to off. Basically, this is going to say what is driving this change in radius. So if I set this to be, I set my lifespan back to random range. So I'll go by age. And you'll notice, theoretically, if you ever see a change and it doesn't work, try going through and either selecting, okay, there we go. So for some reason I had to just like restart my sim. So it seems like normalized age in this case works better. But you can see that like when they're originally spawned, they're huge, and then they sort of like peter off into nothingness. So you can use like age or speed or whatever other drop-downs they give you to, that is a very interesting way to make flashing lights, to sort of control different stuff. A lot of people use it for like opacity and color if you're doing, fire or something like that. So I'm just going to set this actually back to being turned off. And I will pause and restart my sim. The change will then take effect. So you can also do stuff like play with collisions. One thing to turn on, so if I turn on self-collide, you can see it behave like the particles are no longer being spawned inside each other. They're sort of like moving apart. If you have enough particles, that's going to make your sim time go up way longer, but if you're doing something like gumballs with these, you pretty much need to turn it on. Stuff like rain or like really small particle effects, usually you won't even notice if stuff is clipping through each other. But you can change a bunch of different stuff. Like my personal favorite is like bounce. If you want to make these like crazy, crazy bouncy. All right. But you can do kind of like, again, different stuff in here. If you've ever played with Endcloth, it's really similar. There's also some other options for like how much, dynamics weight is basically like a multiplier on your, any other like fields, gravity, stuff like that you have. So if you set this to be lower, it's just going to have a little bit less effect from gravity. So you can see these are like falling a little bit slower now. Turn it up, they fall faster. You can mess with different properties like drag, dampening, etc. I usually honestly just sort of like play with these a lot until they kind of get what I want to happen. Any questions on that so far? All right. So you'll notice right now that like the particles are just sort of clipping through this head. And literally the only reason I brought this head in is so I could show you how to make the particles interact with it. So, basically if I want the particles to interact with this head or like any other object in your scene, I would need to select that object and go to Endcloth, create passive collider. I've found that the Ncloth passive collider is by far the most robust in terms of most things will interact with this. There are, under the nParticles settings, some stuff about like make collide and other, similar stuff that it seems like should work, and I've never gotten them to work once. The only thing I've made work is the Ncloth passive collider. So again, I'll just set that object to be a passive collider, and you can see that now my particles are sort of, let me set my back to live forever, and you can see that the particles are sort of now spilling around this head. And you can also see that as soon as I do that, it is taking a significantly longer time to sim. It's also because I've set these to live forever. So now if you notice, like, again, if you set stuff to live forever, you become inundated with a very large quantity of particles. So what I could do is set this to something like constant and then maybe like 3 or something like that. So then the particles would spawn and they would sort of die sooner. Please don't crash. I feel a crash coming. Yep. All right. While Maya's reopening, anyone have any questions about particles or anything else so far? Alrighty then. Maya is insane, is what I'm going with. All right. I will say it does open incredibly fast on these computers, and I very much enjoy it. All right, so I'm going to be too lazy to actually drag the head back in, so I'll just make a sphere with a big plane under it. So again, FX, nParticles, create emitter, Ncloth, passive collider. And if I go into my outliner, find the emitter, and drag it up. I'm just gonna really quick set the particles to be spheres again, because I feel like they're probably easier for you guys to see. So again, if that's the particle shape node under shading, just set that to sphere, and then you should be able to go up under particle size and just make that a little bit larger. So let's do 1,000 frames. All right, oh my God. All right. The beautiful settings when you forget to set your playback speed to max real time. So I'm going to, what am I doing? Grab my particles, and I'll just set the lifespan to something like 3 so that they don't stay in my scene forever and slow everything down super crazy. All right, and it looks like I actually didn't set the Ncloth thing, so I'm just going to do create passive collider again, and then it's actually put the rigid in. So now, again, we're pretty much where we were before, where we have these ridiculous particles streaming off of this circle. If you ever want to like make these stick, so I'm thinking for something like snow, where like it lands on you and it sticks there, there's a few different ways to do that. You can either go into your particle settings themselves under, I think it's, yeah, so under collision in your particles, you can turn the friction up super high. What that's usually going to do is just make them sort of, they'll still fall off eventually, it just takes them longer. What you can do if you need them to be really, really sticky is turn on stickiness. And that will literally pretty much permanently affix them. Like if you're blasting this with particles, wherever that particle touches the object is going to stay there. You'll also notice that at this point, it's pretty much just making a big pool of particles. It's because I don't have self-collide turned on. If I turn that on, it's going to start actually dropping these objects a little bit differently. The other thing you can do, so that's if you want the particles to stick to anything they touch. I'm thinking, I was like, maybe something like spray paint, and I'm like, that would be so many particles. If you want it to just be a specific object, you would just want to go into the rigid body for that particular object. And again, you could just set either set friction really high, so you can see that like wherever the particles are touching, they sort of slow down, but the rest of them are going like they normally would. Or if you want everything to stick, again, just turn stickiness up, and then it'll sort of like cluster onto your object. So it really just depends on what you want. That's a basic way to have things interact with objects. So really quick, I'm going to go through and I'll make the ground a passive collider as well, so that if I restart my sim, the particles should actually like roll on the ground. So again, actually really good for stuff like gumballs. Any questions on that? I want to show you a cool thing you can do where you sort of like break up your particles if you're doing rain or something similar. Questions before we go on? All right, cool. Oh, and I just actually realized that you guys go till 11:30. So I'm going to take my emitter, and this is, like I said, a good setup for sort of rain or assorted effects like snow and stuff like that. So I'm going to set this to be a volume emitter. I will set this to emit sort of in a shape kind of like this. So if I play that, you can see now we have a little bit ridiculous looking, but this would be sort of the basic setup for something like rain. What I would probably also want to do is maybe set it to more particles per second, so it's generating like heavier snow or something like that. In this case, I don't really want to break the computer, so I'm just going to set this to be the standard 100. So this is also where you can go in for something like, what is it? 100, not 10. You can also go in and set the, so actually for a volume emitter, they actually gray out speed, so you kind of can't set speed. So if I wanted this to do something, again, like rain, where it's falling really, really fast, usually I kind of cheat, and I will just go in to my nucleus and set gravity to something like 400. And then you'll see things sort of start falling much, much faster. So yeah, so that's pretty much as aggressive as you can get. So normally, there are better ways to do it. It's just sort of a pain. This is the easiest way if you're just using, one sim in your scene to sort of set something like this up. The other thing that you can do if you want to is not use the nucleus itself. If you grab the particles and do fields and solvers gravity, you can make a gravity field that will operate only on those particles. So if you have other sims in your scene, like something for a dynamic curve, it's not going to be affected by the insanely aggressive gravity. But yeah, so. And the basic premise that I'm operating on for something like rain is I could theoretically leave this as a, gray Lambert sphere or whatever. If I turn on motion blur in my render, it will then kind of look like rain if the particles are moving fast enough. So I'm going to just turn on physical sky real quick, go into my render view, and this is going to be like really ugly. But you'll see, so this is no motion blur, and it does just look like insane little dots. If I go into my render settings and I then actually just check on the motion blur setting, you'll see that these stretch out a lot, and this doesn't quite look like rain, but it looks a lot more like rain than it did before. And you can't really tell, because of how blurred they are, that they're just untextured little spheres. So this is like actually kind of a thing that's, if you make them even smaller, it looks even more like rain. So you don't even really need to do a lot of stuff with transparency or anything like that. You really, a lot of times, do just sort of need to turn on motion blur. And do just be aware, though, like if you're doing something like this for rain, it's probably going to boost your render times pretty aggressively because of all of that motion blur if you're doing this with like a much higher particle density. So it's a good thing to sort of test and see what it does to your render times before you commit to doing this. The other thing I usually do for stuff like rain in particular, you don't really need a lot of like shadows and stuff like that on it. So if I look at, say, this area here, I mean, I'll show you how to get rid of these particles in a sec, but you can save a little bit of render time by turning off the shadows for those particles. So if I just go in to my end particles, if you go into the shape node like you would for an object, if you want to mess with the shadows there, there's the Arnold tab, pretty much like there is with a regular object, and you can, again, take off stuff like cast shadows. I usually turn off diffuse reflection. I'll leave it in specular because like a lot of times if it's like a window or something, it'll sort of reflect the rain, so I think that makes sense to keep. But you can turn off like all of these random things and also turn off self shadows, and usually that will speed up your render time pretty dramatically. In this case, it doesn't make a huge difference, but this is pretty much just like the difference that it shows in the render. And again, for stuff like the actual falling particles of rain, you don't notice at all. For stuff like on the ground, I'll show you how to kill the particles once it hits the ground so you don't just have little pellets of rain laying there. Any questions on that so far? Yep.
So sometimes like rain can go like, it can rain sideways. So like how would you like do something like that?
A fair question. So there's usually a few different ways I would approach that. So one is you can actually add wind speed into the simulation. So if I set this up to something like 500, like a crazy person, you can see it's sort of like blowing sideways a little bit. Because it's behaving a little strangely because I set gravity so absurdly high. So you can see like if I turn my gravity down, the particles are actually blowing sideways. So that's one way to do it, is in the nucleus. The other thing that you can do is go through, and kind of like I mentioned before, if you grab the emitter and then do a fields and solvers airfield, you can also fields and solvers air. All right, so right now this is actually not hooked up to anything. So if you grab your airfield and your particles, do fields and solvers, and just assign to selected, it'll sort of connect them together so that that airfield is affecting your particles. But you can do the same thing basically there, where you can go in and sort of, oh, okay. That's really weird. So you can see it's doing that because the direction is set to 1 in the positive y. If I set that to like 1 on the x, it'll start blowing stuff as it hits the ground. There's a few different sort of settings for these, but the airfields specifically work by, ooh, I actually just had another terrible idea. But as I say, the airfields work specifically around the area where they are. So you'll notice like this side isn't really being affected, but this side is. This could be a way to like blow some leaves from a leaf blower or something like that. You'll notice if I keyframe this airfield going across my sim, it sort of will blow around that airfield, if that makes sense. You could also, if you were so inclined, make another gravity field. So just like make a separate gravity field and look at the direction. So right now it's set at -1. If we just set that to 0 and set this to 1 and set this to be like 5,000, it's basically just going to act as if, I need to restart that. Oh, okay, so I actually forgot to hook it up to my particle system, which is why it's not doing anything. So grab the gravity field, grab the emitter, fields and solvers, and again, assign to selected. It's probably gonna yell at me, or was it particle field? Whoops. All right, sorry, assign it to the particle, not the emitter. Because remember, the emitter is just spawning particles. It's the particles themselves that are actually interacting with the airfield. I just do that every single time I go to click stuff. Holy crap. Well, that's a thing that I've done. But yeah, I basically just set up another gravity field to sort of behave like wind, but just in the most aggressive way humanly possible. So there's like, I guess, a few sort of different ways to achieve the wind effect. If you want to, in the nucleus, and I do kind of like these because I think they're fun, but you can add wind noise in there, so it'll give you like a little bit of like fluttering and stuff to your wind. There's also other fields you can play with, like turbulence will do kind of the similar thing. So there's like a bajillion different ways to sort of play with your particles. I actually recommend sort of going through some of these and playing with them, because there's some really fun effects in here. I feel like this is mostly meant to be a brief overview, but yeah, there's some cool stuff you can do with these. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Cool. Yeah, no, sims are really fun. You can also sort of attach sims to, like, you can do light fluid sims with particles, and it's really weird. You can also use particles and spawn them on a surface to populate objects, and it's just, there's like a lot of weird stuff you can do with them. That's like, they're surprisingly versatile. But yes, so if we want to have our particles, I'm just gonna kind of leave that there. I think it's kind of cool. So if we want to have our particles go in and say, imagine this is like rain. When a drop of rain hits the ground, it usually sort of like poofs into different little mini raindrops before dying. So I'll show you how to get that effect. It's actually really handy and pretty simple. It's also good for stuff like sparks or fireworks if you wanted to like shoot a particle into the air and then have it explode. It works really well for this kind of stuff. So go into your N particles and open the particle collision event editor. It'll pull up this lovely box, and basically for each particle or each rigid body, you can create specific events that will affect how they behave. So in this case, I want it to be on the particles. I'm just going to call this event explode. It doesn't super matter what you call it. And basically, it's going to ask you when do you actually want this to happen. So I want it to happen on all collisions. So like if a raindrop hits anything, it should explode. If you uncheck that, you can set specific number of collisions. So maybe like after every 5 collisions, this event will happen. But again, for this one, I just want all. And then I always have issues with split. So in this case, what I'm going to do is basically I'll hit emit, and this is what's happening is anytime one of my original particles touches an object or collides with something, it's going to become its own mini emitter and make more particles. So I'm going to set the number of particles to something maybe 5. You can make that random if you want to, mess with the spread, etc. Inherent velocity I usually keep turned on. This is basically if your original particle is moving really fast, that velocity is going to be transferred to the new particles. And then I'm also going to, so if you think about it, when the basically raindrop at this point is hitting the ground, it's exploding into multiple little particles, so I want the original one to disappear and be replaced by these new particles. So I'm going to turn on the original particle dies. So basically anytime the particle hits something, it's going to vanish from existence and spawn some more particles. And I'm just going to do create event. So you'll notice as soon as I did that, it adds this little event up here. So you can come back and look at these later. And it's also actually added an entirely new particle system. And that is now selectable here if I want to use that. So really quick, I'm just going to grab these extra particles. I'll set these to spheres. And tra-la-la. All right, I'm just going to set the color of these to be like a blue color. So if I play this now, you'll notice that like as soon as my original particles are hitting the ground, they pretty much disappear, and then they're being replaced by all of these derpy little blue particles here. So yeah, they each basically become their own little emitter. What's kind of, oh yeah, incidentally, this is also where I could input something like age into the color, and that would be sort of like if you wanted to make a fire effect where it like starts really bright and then like sort of fades. But anywho. So in this case, I do think it's a little bit weird. Like I also want these particles to disappear because it's weird to have just a bunch of raindrops rolling around on the ground. So if I go once again into my little particle collision editor, click on the N particle 2, and I'm going to call this event death because I'm overdramatic. And this one I don't want necessarily to happen on all collisions. I'm going to say, I know sometimes like if you've ever watched rain, it'll sort of like bounce and then that drop will skitter once or twice. So I'll set this to like a collision number of maybe 2. So if this will basically be spawned, collide with things twice, and then die. I don't want this to emit anymore. I want this to just be the last of this raindrop, but I do want the original particle to die. So I'll make that event. It's labeled here. If you ever need to go back and edit your events, you can just sort of click on the different particles and go back and edit these as needed. So I play this now. You'll notice that those particles spawn and they're very slowly dying. You just can't really tell. So what I'm going to do is actually go in, and if these particles hit each other, I would also like them to die. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn on under collisions self-collide. So this is just going to register a lot more collisions. So turn on self-collide. Holy crap. They're just like exploding everywhere. All right. It can take a little fiddling to get these to behave the way you want them to. So in this case, I'm going to go back into my particles under death and say number of collisions. Let's just do all collisions and call that a day. So hopefully once these collide like with the ground, you can see that they're then just sort of exploding. And this is maybe a little bit aggressive with the particles. Why are these not dying? Because that should definitely be killing my particles faster. Interesting. All right, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time troubleshooting why that's not working. Normally, it works significantly better than that, where it will just sort of kill your particles. You could also just sort of set your age to be random, and set this to maybe like 0.5 or something like that, so that in the event that your little particle event doesn't work, like mine for some reason wasn't, they just sort of die off much sooner. But you can see it kind of makes like an interesting little effect where you get like that little like poof of water on the ground. And then this second particle, so this is the kind of thing where like I would recommend for this one, maybe making this one a little bit of like an actual transparent material, since you would be seeing, they're moving much slower, so you would actually see them in your render. But again, it's really kind of a cool effect if you wanted to do something like a firework that like explodes into a bunch of different particles or something like that. Yeah. Any questions on that? All right. Is there any other stuff you guys want to see with particles? All right. Be really quick. I just want to see what happens if I throw some more particles at it. So you'll notice it also kind of works when they hit the sphere, or if I like make the sphere larger, that would also affect, and then it would, you know, sort of bounce off that. But that is like basically my super crazy brief intro to particles. Again, really helpful for stuff, and there's a lot of crazy stuff that you can do with them relatively easily. So that being said, last call for questions. I'm going to go on to some MASH stuff if no one has questions. All right. MASH stuff it is. So MASH is basically a way you can go through in Maya and just like very, very easily generate objects basically on a surface. So I'm going to also go through and just make a CV curve tool. Have a good day. Yeah. So I'll just make like this random curve. And then I'm going to say, I'm just going to jump straight into it and actually show you guys how to make barbed wire. So this involves like two stupid hacks. So for my barbed wire, I'm going to say I want like two little pieces of wire that are twisted around each other. And I want little like spiky barbs on that wire. So I'm just going to go ahead and make just like a generic two little flat circular planes, do a mesh combine on those, and I'm going to extrude these along my curve. So I'll snapping's being stupid. All right, that's Maya, why are you being terrible? All right, basically just move this as close as you can to the beginning of your curve. For some reason, snapping is not working. And then sort of rotate it also in the direction that you want this laid out. So what you're going to do if you ever want to extrude a piece of, you know, regular geometry along a curve, you actually just use the normal extrude tool that you would usually use on poly modeling. So if you grab your object, right-click on it and just grab all the faces, and then shift-click on your curve and do extrude. And again, same extrude like I normally use. Yes, good. So this is, it will extrude it from, basically from your object to the end of the curve. And in this case, this one does care about direction, so you do need to put it put the object on the first part of the curve that you generated. So I put it at the end of it. This is the first point I made, so I'm just going to shift it over there. Huzzah. And kind of call that halfway decent. All right. So again, you have to grab the faces themselves of the object, then the curve, then just do extrude. And you can see that again, it extrudes from the object to the end of the curve. And it's not following the curve because there's no geometry in here. If we go into the little divisions box and just scrub some more geometry into that, it's doing a pretty good job. I'm going to add like maybe 80 divisions. It does a pretty good job of like actually following that that curve that we created. The cool thing about this is the same thing with like an extruded NURB surface. If you grab part of your curve, it's going to dynamically modify that like blob of bendy geometry we now have. I'm going to go and just mesh display reverse that. But what we want, so I mean this is actually not bad if you want to make like a Twizzler, but I would like this to be, you know, twisted wire or some kind of like rope looking effect. So if you grab the disc that you made, go in and find the poly extrude in your channel box. And if you scroll down somewhere down here, there's an attribute for twist. And you're probably going to have to set this up to something really absurd like, let's try 5,000 because apparently 500 isn't enough. All right, so once we set this to something crazy like 5,000, you will see that it has actually gone through and twisted that wire for us. You'll also notice that it behaves kind of stupidly towards the end where it's like a little bit less twisted. If you really care about the sort of spacing of that twist, it's dependent on the number of CV curves or where you put the control vertices in your object. So like right here, it's a lot denser than the original part. So what you can do is go in to just select your curve and do curves, where is it? Somewhere, rebuild. So again, just curves, rebuild, and then for number of spans, just set that to maybe something like 40 or 12 or like whatever you think makes sense. But you can see it'll go through and basically remake your curve with that selected number of spans in it, and they're like equally distant, equidistantly spaced. And theoretically, that should go through and actually, sweet, it actually goes through and updates your the twist of your curve, so you don't need to like redo anything with that. And again, this still works if you want to go through and grab like soft select or something like that, and you can drag this up and down, and it's going to edit that mesh for you. It does behave, as you can see, a little strangely when you grab that first vertex near the end piece that you created. But this is basically how to sort of make a braided rope or the base of our barbed wire. Any questions on that? All right. So what we want for actual barbed wire, and this is where MASH kind of comes in, I'm going to just make a silly helix and probably not do a whole heck of a lot to the settings with this. I will make it a little bit wider, and nobody ever wants 50 axes. All right, so this is going to be the base of our little spiky wire. I'm just going to grab these ends, extrude those out, smooth that. So we have now silly spiky wire. Basically what we want is this to be positioned on our barbed wire. And to do that, again, we're going to use MASH. So what I'm going to do is just select my little helix. There is a tab right in the same line as like the poly modeling tab for MASH. And if you want to, first thing you usually do with MASH is just create this MASH network. Button all the way on the left, click that, and by default, it will set up, it's actually hidden the original mesh, and it's set up this little duplicated version of a bunch of these little helixes. And the other thing I like to do while working with MASH is, it's basically the MASH editor. It's like the outliner for MASH, pretty much. It'll show you the thing that you've just created, this little MASH network, as well as any modifiers or whatever you placed on it. It makes life so much easier when working with MASH. So if I just click on this MASH distribute node, you'll see that the number of points is set to 2. We have 2 copies of our original object. If I make more of these, we now have a crap ton of a lot more little barbed wire chunks. You can also mess with the distance. So I don't know why it defaults to just making a straight line of objects, but that's just sort of what it defaults to. In this case, what we actually want is for these to be following and attached to the curve. So if we go back to our original MASH network, you'll see that there's a bunch of options for add node. And if I want this one attached on a curve, I'm going to select the curve option. And you'll see it actually, if you mouse over them, it actually gives you a little description of what each of these tools do. So I select curve, just do add curve node. And it's going to ask you for like what curve do you want to attach to this. I'm just going to grab curve 1, and Mash is weird. Sometimes you need to drag it right now. Whoops. I've done bad. Crap. When you undo, okay, sorry. Undid everything, remade my curve. Grab the curve and just drag it into the input curve, the giant box that I, for some reason, was ignoring. And you'll see that it's sort of kind of following the curve, but not quite. That's because of how the distribute node is set up. So right now, again, we have like the distance x, which is basically pushing these little barbed wire pieces off of the curve. If we set that to 0, you can see they're actually following the curve. So what we can do is go through and play with some of these settings. So the step is basically how far along the curve it's distributing these. And you can see that it does a fairly decent job of doing equidistant spacing on these. Let's go back to distribute, say maybe I want some more little spiky things. And now it's pretty much positioned these equidistantly on the curve. They're just facing the wrong direction, and there's some other pretty obvious errors with this. So what I want to do is, for one, I want this wire to wrap around the little rope thing I've created, which is clearly not positioned correctly to do that. So what I'm going to do is actually unhide the original helix that I made. And if you rotate that, it will copy the rotation to everything in your Mash network. So I'll just set that to be 90, and then I'll also just sort of scale that down so that this is more or less like kind of reasonably attached to the rest of my object. So that's all fine and dandy. That's like the basics of how to distribute something along a Mash curve. You can do the same thing with polygons. Any questions on that? All right. So in this case, I think the barbed wire still looks kind of stupid because all of the barbs are facing the exact same direction. So I'm just going to go back to my original Mash network and go in and look at the orient node. So if you just do add one of them, you'll notice that it rotates them all a completely different direction. And let's see here. All right. Up vector. Okay, so it's looking at the up vector. So you can set this to be different things if you want. Oh, that's super weird. Okay. So it's been a hot minute since I've set this up. All right. So in this case, I might actually just sort of casually turn this off. I don't know. But basically what you can do is go through and what are you doing with your life? Hang on, sorry. Okay, cool. That's what I wanted. All right. So basically I went through, and this obviously still needs a little bit of refining, but you can go through and turn on the like only rotate along the Y, and you can sort of control like the randomness of how that's actually working. So if I go through and just like set random strength, you can see that it's sort of like starting to rotate these in like a little bit more of a random direction. You can set, if you set strength to 0, basically turns off your rotation node. Just set this to, all right, I don't know why that's being so insane. But yeah, so I mean, you can kind of use this again to like add a little bit more rotation to your object. Weird. 5-second test. All right. It's been several months since I've tried to set this up. But basically, you should be able to sort of like fiddle with this so that it's only rotating along the axis that you actually want it to, so that it basically stays like wrapped around the little wire part, but the barbs just sort of point off in different directions. So it's like kind of a wonky demo, but that's more or less the process that you would use to do that. Are there any questions on that? All right. So you can use the same basic premise to generate stuff like Christmas lights, which I know a lot of you guys are doing for your scene. Basically, you just want to, instead of making little barbed wires, make actual Christmas lights. And then you could set them to, you can assign them new materials, like you can with the particles. So I'm just going to do AI standard surface shader and make a sad little ground plane. And if we grab the surface shader, and again, so what we can do is actually set that to just be a mesh light if we wanted to. Does anyone remember the difference between mesh lights and emissive objects in terms of like how the light is calculated?
One takes longer to render.
That is true. Yeah, so basically what happens is a mesh light is a physically accurate light where it's bouncing the light like, you know, an actual glowing Christmas light bulb would do. An emissive object is just sort of, it's not physically accurate, but it just sort of creates a general glow around your object. So for certain instances, they both look pretty much the same. If you need something that's like really hardcore accurate, you would want to go with a mesh light. Physical lights are good for stuff sort of around, or like in the background of your object, you know, like you had Christmas lights in the background, that'd be great for an emissive object. Does that make sense? Cool. And this is, what have I done? There's like that weird trick for setting up mesh lights, which I'm just for some reason completely forgetting. But yeah, but I mean, point is you can basically assign these objects like you would anything else. And if you wanted to, you could make them emissive. Basically how you do Christmas lights. So that's sort of MASH on a curve. Really quick, any questions on that before I get rid of this thing? All right. Cool. So, okay, I've deleted everything except the thing I didn't want to delete. Great. So you can do MASH on an object as well. So this I'll throw my head back in here. And I'm just gonna delete everything but the head. So if I wanted to, I could spawn a bunch of objects on this head, which I've actually done before, and it's weirdly helpful sometimes. So I'm just gonna say I want a bunch of little spheres on this head, or you know, sprinkles on a ground, something like that. You can make this whatever shape you want. I just don't need to do anything crazy fancy with this. Actually, I will. Okay, I'm just for the sake of, I want to be able to see some rotation on this. I'm going to say that this is the world's ugliest bacteria that's ever been modeled, and this is what we're going to stick on my head. So basically, do the same thing that you did before. Just grab your original object, go to the MASH tab, and make a new little MASH network. So you can see this one's gone through and again pretty much done the same thing as the original one where it's just made a bunch of duplicates of my object. So what I'm going to do is go into my, what are you doing? What? All right, go into your MASH network, and this one I'm actually going to, go into my distribute node and do distribution type on a mesh. And if you set this to mesh, it's going to ask you which mesh do you want. So I'm just going to grab my head and drag that into input mesh. And you can see that now it's put these like ridiculous looking little things on all over the head. And there's a few different ways you can actually lay these out on the head. I'm going to turn these green just for some visual flavor. But there's a few different ways you can lay these out. So right now, obviously it's set to scatter. It's just sort of positioning these randomly all over the head. If you wanted to, you could set this to vertex, and that's going to, I'm honestly not entirely sure how it picks these points, but it'll go through and basically spawn one of these like weird little geometry things on each vertex in the head. This looks really weird. But you can see, like again, it's pretty much following more or less where all of those vertices are for like this strip and this strip, and it'll just keep going until it hits all of the vertices, at which point it'll start like overlapping your objects. But you can do sort of weird, interesting stuff where if you key this value, it'll just sort of continuously populate more of these weird objects in your scene. You can also set this to face center, which again is pretty much going to do exactly what you expect and put it in the one little object in the middle of each face. So I'm just going to do scatter for now and be like, holy crap. So you can do like weird stuff like this. Again, this is something like I would use for sprinkles. If you want to, you can do push along normal, which is basically we'll just sort of push it. Oh, that would be helpful for an unrelated project. Basically, we'll push it along the normal away from your character. Could potentially be interesting for like exploding, just be like, ha, and then, you know, key it to a larger value or something like that. So that's populating an object, populating a MASH object sort of on a random object. And again, you can go through and you can add stuff like orient nodes to this. Actually, oh, I'm a dingus. All right, so you can add random nodes, which I'm going to do really quick. Oh, I'm a dingus. Okay, so remember when I was like, when I was doing the barbed wire, I was like, the orient node is being really weird. I actually didn't want an orient node, I wanted a random node, and I just forgot that I wanted a random node. So by default, let me show you how these work really quick. They start out as just moving everything 1 unit away from the head. So you can, you know, right now I'm just going to mess with rotation. I don't really want these translating. So I'll just set all of the positions to 0. And then this is where if I just wanted them to rotate along a specific object or like a specific axis, you can just set the rotation Y specifically, or you can do all of them at once. And that is what I was trying to do on the barbed wire. I just forgot that the random node existed. You can also mess with scale if you want to, for some rather questionable effects. And then if you can sort of go in and like play with the random strength so that like some of these are ginormous and some of them are really small. But this is a really great way to sort of get variation into your scene, especially if you're using just sort of like a generic object. You can even use this for stuff like grass textures to have them like facing different ways, like a slightly different in scale, just make things a little bit more varied. And then you can set stuff, the difference I think between absolute and uniform scale is, I actually completely forget what that is, but you can see that they have slightly different effects, and you can play with them to get whatever effect you need. What I expected that to do is not what it actually did. But that's more or less the random node. You can also go in. Has this just not updated my random node? Weird, okay. So there's like a bunch of different stuff you can do with this. I'm not gonna super go into a lot of these. One that's kind of cool is time. You can use this for doing like a little bit of like wavy motion in your grass, stuff like that. So again, let's just see if we do animation end. So you can sort of go through and have it, wait, what the, wait, no, sorry, I was thinking of something completely different. You can use this to animate stuff, you just need to set up a bunch of other things, which I don't really want to show you right now. So that's, I think, probably most of the MASH that would be helpful for just like building your object. And you could actually do something, so like if you set up a dynamic curve, say for something like Christmas lights where you had, you know, a little draped light that was blowing slightly in the wind, you could extrude like the twisted wire along that and use MASH to generate some Christmas lights on it, and then as that little curve sort of blew in the wind, it would take all of your MASH stuff with it. So that's also a really, really easy way to get like some light animation into the background of your scene. Any questions on any of that? Yes?
Can you try to save the scene? Because I know there was an issue with MASH. I just want to make sure that's not a thing anymore.
That is a fair point. I feel like probably going to regret this.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It seems to have saved fine.
And this is not locked up, you can still... Yep, okay.
Okay.
Hopefully
Yeah.
they fix that issue. 'Cause
Yeah.
It was actually a widespread problem for a bit there.
Weird. Yeah, I do remember, I think you mentioning that before.
Yeah, I know, like a few months ago.
Yeah. But yeah. so that's MASH, basic sim stuff. Next week, I want to go over a little bit about dynamic objects, just like getting good for stuff like making footprints in snow, but mostly just for like sort of animating, you know, blocks or like other secondary objects in your scene, as well as a few random things on NCloth that may also be helpful to you. If not now, then at some point. So cool. That's all I got for you guys. Feel free to wander off. I didn't do my usual be free today.